I have a couple of guests who are here to provide a little bit more insight into an issue that seems to fall fairly squarely into that category we've mentioned quite a lot recently. The things about which you either care passionately or not at all. So Tim, Lancaster fits squarely into the first category. Cares passionately about this, both as a resident of North London, where the impact is likely to be higher than almost anywhere else, but also as a critic of the entire national project. Indeed, he's contributed to that House of Lords report, 970-page report into the £50 billion project. And Tim, you gave written evidence. Can I begin with an unfair question? Would you mind? Sure. What do you think was in George Osborne's head when he came up with this idea? What do you? I mean, to just give them the benefit of the doubt to start with. What do you think is the?
I think he wanted to rebalance the economy. He wanted to move economic activity to the north, but it's not going to do that. It's going to suck economic activity to the south.
Why?
Because that's the experience elsewhere. If you build a high-speed rail from a capital to the outer regions, it doesn't develop the outer regions. What they need up there in the north is improved infrastructure across the north and better communication there. So the rebalancing argument doesn't work, and I don't know any economist who thinks it does. I mean, there were two other aims. One was to improve capacity, and the other was to improve journey times. Well, it does both of those, but the cost is horrendous. I mean, it's good to increase capacity and improve journey times, but if the cost is enormous, you don't do it.
I mean, in terms of priorities, yeah. I can see the argument about rebalancing the economy is the most powerful one of all, because it's almost as if the actual ramifications for travellers and workers are secondary to just this enormous bomb of money that would explode in the middle of the economy and revivify parts of it that other investment cannot reach.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's going to do that, you see. I think it may be good for London in the long term, but it's actually very bad for London in the short term. It's going to be a disaster for rail passengers coming into Euston while the work's being done.
We'll get onto that in a minute, the sort of local difficulty that I know you're well placed to comment on. Also on the line is Sir Simon Jenkins, who's former editor of the Evening Standard and, of course, the Times, and indeed a former chair of the National Trust. Which hat are you wearing today, Simon? Are you objecting on aesthetic grounds with your National Trust hat on, or on economic grounds with your journalistic hat on?
I'm not. I'm objecting as a citizen of London.
That's a third hat. So what do you dislike about it?
It's probably the craziest railway line ever invented. I mean, it makes no sense at all. As Tim said, it'll benefit London because any railway line you build benefits the stronger end of the line. The stronger end of the line here is London. Paris has benefited from all the APT investments and so on. But that's not the point in a sense. It's designed firstly to get people fast. Then they abandon that when people say they didn't know to go fast. It's now about capacity. This is not a priority for capacity. Capacity into London is on Paddington, Waterloo and Victoria. Euston is one of the, I won't say low capacity, it's very busy, but it's one of the lowest capacity lines into London. And it comes into Euston, which is one of the most useless of termini. It's only on the Victoria line. It really is a very stupid place to build a railway to. The sensible thing to do if you're going to build it is to stop it at Acton and Old Oak Common, which I still believe they may end up doing.
And then you've got much better access to the local transport infrastructure. I'll ask you what I asked Tim, and it's a slightly odd question, but I'd be grateful for your answer, which is what was behind the original decision in your opinion? What made this apparently irresistible to George Osborne?
Well, I mean,
previous
was very peculiar. It was an alternative to building an extra runway at Heathrow.
Yes.
David Cameron who came up with it for that reason. And it's one of those things in transport policy. It just seemed like a good idea somewhere in the distance.
But that's the thing that confuses me, Simon, to be honest with you, because listening to expert analysis like yours and Sir Tim's, I can't quite glimpse that moment when it did seem like a good idea.
Well, the government wanted to do something for railways because it supposedly refused the third runway to Heathrow.
Right.
Cameron said, over my dead body will there be a third runway to Heathrow. I better have something different. And he came up with the railway line from Manchester to Heathrow. That was the origin of it. Then that was chipped away at, and people said there's no point in running it to Heathrow. Just run it to Old Oak Common and then come into Euston. That's what actually happened. They then looked at all kinds of alternatives for doing that. And this was one of the better alternatives if you literally wanted to go from Manchester into London. But I mean, what happens is you get this tremendous pressure from big lobbyists and consultancies and contractors and so on. They all pile in behind it. They're spending 300 or 400 million a year now on it. And no one has a vested interest in reviewing the project and seeing if it wouldn't better go somewhere else.
This is a personal question in a way. I'm hearing echoes of the Garden Bridge here. Is that it's almost as if they've thrown so much money after it now they can't admit that it's all a disaster and pull the plug immediately.
Yes, the Garden Bridge is a pea compared to a mountain.
Of course.
But I mean, it is exactly what you say. It's sort of, someone put this forward as a good idea. It sounds terrific. Lots of people leap up and down and say, this is the macho things before. And nobody stops and says, look, one thing, do we any sense need it? And secondly, is it the best place for it? And the Garden Bridge, I think, should be upstream at Battersea or something like that. It's a lovely project. But it should not be blocking the view of St Paul's just because a couple of celebrities suggested it.
A couple of celebrities suggested it, indeed. So, Tim, this question of the impact upon your part of London in particular, I presume that when the North Circular Road was built, there were plenty of people complaining that it was going to impact upon their locale unfairly. When the M25 was built, Canary Wharf even had complaints from people sort of indigenous to the area at the time. Why is this different? Why is this sort of not mere NIMBYism?
Well, what's different about this one is that the construction work's going to go on for 17 years. Phase 1 for the first 6 platforms they want to put in at Euston, and another 7 years or something for the second lot. And then we've got to redevelop Euston. So it's the length of time, it's the number of people who are going to be affected. They're going to be, huge numbers of people. And there's going to be gridlock across North London. We're going to have 900 trucks a day ploughing through Camden. There's going to be
Where does that figure come from? Where do you get?
No, it's in the HS2. It's HS2.
That's their own numbers. Yeah. They're not even denying that. If someone like Liam's just tweeted with, and I don't think he's being facetious, he says, look, okay, all of this is true, but think of it of having a 200-year lifespan, then all of this is a price worth paying, both materially and convenience.
Well, I mean, 17 years is a lot. If it was 3 years, we'd say okay.
Would you? Are you sure?
The other thing is we need a Euston that makes sense. What they're going for is a sort of bolt-on Euston, an HS2 station, and then a redeveloped Euston. Network Rail and HS2 have got to get their heads together. They're at loggerheads now. The department needs to pull them together. Chris Grayling needs to pull them together, produce an integrated design for Euston Station, and until that is done, there should be no further work at the Euston end.
Because the right arm isn't talking to the left arm.
Exactly.
It's quite bizarre, actually. So, Simon Jenkins, you've covered an awful lot of issues over the years. Can you? Obviously, the Garden Bridge comparison was a little disproportionate. Can you think of anything on this scale that you've witnessed in the past? Because it's very hard to find a proper cheerleader.
You asked him about North Circular. God knows we could do with a North Circular. There is an exact parallel in much the same line of country. It's called the Motorway Box. And I remember it well. It was back in the 70s. The Motorway Box was proposed to crash across London just north of Regent's Park. It was going to do devastation right across North London and South London. Bits of the East and West were built. But the general view eventually was this was just too big a project to inflict on central London. It was for all time. It made all kinds of sense. I mean, Paris has got a bit of one. People very wisely said it's just not needed. We just got to push the congestion further out. And I think exactly the same applies to HS2. You don't need it in the country. It's mostly about the outer London southeast congestion. Push the congestion onto other lines, come into Paddington, come into Old Oak Common. You do not need to come into Euston. I honestly think, and I have to say, and I've spoken to all the people involved in this, nobody would propose it today. I guess that's what I've been pushing you towards. That's what I find as someone who's not sort of particularly immersed in this issue. Is what I find bizarre is the simple question of genesis. But I've got a better understanding of that now. Very briefly,
James, can I just come in very briefly?
Course, absolutely, I'd be offended if you didn't.
It's very interesting that the majority of the people in Birmingham don't want this scheme. I mean, they realise that it's not going to do much for Birmingham, and they realise that there are higher priorities for this sort of spending.
And that kind of is the point. Where does the pressure need to be applied, Simon Jenkins? And if you were in charge, what switch would you flick first?
Oh, I would just stop it. I'd switch to this thing called HS3, which is not a line, but HS3 is chronically needed rail investment in the north, particularly between Lancaster and Yorkshire. And I was up there recently. They desperately need this kind of money. London does not desperately need it. It just doesn't. I'm afraid it's very simple. I mean, Theresa May could have killed Hinkley Point and should have done so. I'm deeply depressed she didn't. She just needs to throw the switch and say, right, stop HS2 right now, spend no more money on it, let's concentrate on building in the north.